On September 9, 1949, Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight number 108 departed Montreal for Baie-Comeau. The destination was the fishing village of Baie-Comeau, a small but important settlement for local commerce. The flight had to be delayed a few minutes for a late passenger who had decided to have a fight with her husband right before departure. But no other problems were expected on the way. The weather was flying, and there were almost no clouds in the sky. The flight had to make a couple of stops along the way, but overall, the route was quick and easy. 10 minutes into the flight, Captain Pierre Larin received notification that the Quebec stopover could be skipped. He confirmed that the message had been received. It was the last thing the experienced pilot uttered in his life. A T-10-45 Flight 108 exploded in mid-air. And so begins the story we're going to tell you about today. It's a story of human greed and ego, and about one of the most absurd crimes in Canadian history. And today, we're going to talk about the crash of Flight 108. Residents of the fishing village of Sous-Écoquin looked up sharply at the sight of an explosion in the sky. Employees at the airport where the airliner took off from also raised their heads. The airplane had not traveled far. They all saw a cloud of white smoke billow out of the left side of the airplane. The airliner turned to the north and began to plummet sharply downward. Within seconds it met the ground. The airplane went down in a forest near Sous-Écoquin, where people did not walk much. 5 railroad workers, who also heard the explosion, were the first to arrive at the crash site. As they made their way through the dense thicket, they expected to see the airplane engulfed in flames. When they reached the site nearly an hour later, they were greeted by the wreckage of the plane and body parts, and silence. And no screams, no moans, just birdsong. The men realized there was nothing they could do and ran after the police. Quebec provincial police and rescue workers had to get to the site by rail. From it, they cut a path to the crash site, which was used to get there by the cordon. Representatives of the researchers' insurance companies. On the other side, from the highway, journalists and relatives of the victims reached the ruins of the plane. To get there, they had to overcome about 11 kilometers through the forest, and some of them succeeded. The husband of passenger Rita Morel and her 2 brothers tried to break through the cordon, but he was not allowed in. The 3 men stood by, waiting for the worst to be confirmed. The victims of the crash were 23 people, 19 passengers, including 3 young children and 4 crew members. Almost all of them were Canadians, except for 3 American businessmen. On board were Kennecott Copper Corporation President Earl Stand, his successor Arthur Strock, who was due to step in soon, and Russ Parker, the corporation's vice president. One by one the bodies, wrapped in thick sheets, were lowered down to the railroad. There a train with 22 coffins was waiting for them. One of them was left empty. Not even 30 years have passed since the first civilian passenger boarded an airplane in Canada. Commercial aviation in the country began to develop only in the late 30s. Canadian Pacific Airlines existed for only 7 years. The crash of Flight 108 was one of the first disasters in the history of civil aviation in the country. The police simply had no experience to draw on in the investigation. The first reports read, "The airplane crashed from unknown causes." The only explanation investigators could come up with would stack the blame on the airline, pilot error or equipment failure. That outcome did not suit Canadian Pacific Airlines. Canadian Pacific Railroad's fledgling company, the young airline valued safety above all else since its founding in 1942. Not a single passenger had died on its airplanes. The accident caused an atypical emotional reaction in the company's management, which was ready to defend its brainchild to the last. Beyond emotions, there was a purely pragmatic problem. Compensations to the relatives of the victims would have been significant even if there had not been 3 rich Americans on board. Given this factor, the company was seriously threatened with bankruptcy. Only after hearing about the disaster in Quebec flew out the president of the airline, Earl McConaughey, bringing with him an experienced aircraft engineer, Frank Francis. All Friday, he ran around the agencies concerned, trying to mobilize them to investigate the disaster. Eventually, an army of representatives from the Department of Transportation, Quebec Police, and the Royal Mounted Police assembled. First on the agenda was an autopsy of the crew members. Canadian Pacific Airlines had insisted on this to make sure that the crash was not caused by some ailment of the pilots. The autopsy was delayed a bit by a dispute between 2 teams of coroners, one hired by the airline and the other by the local police. Each believed they were responsible for all the bodies. The conflict was eventually resolved with a compromise. Each team collected half their victims. The autopsies didn't answer any questions. All pilots were healthy at the time of the crash. The crew captain was an experienced pilot who had been with Canadian Pacific since the company's inception. The likelihood of error on a familiar route in favorable weather was extremely low. An army of investigators returned to the crash site. Among them were several of Jean B. Langer's subordinates. He himself, confident of the natural causes of the disaster, did not consider his presence necessary, but he sent among others his trusted assistant Jules Parrott. He visited the crash site on Monday and immediately reported back to his boss, "I don't like it." Frank Rancis felt the same way. Examining the wreckage of the plane, he found that the tips of both propellers were bent on impact with the ground, a sure sign that the engine was running at the time of the crash, which means it was not the cause of the accident. The bodies of the passengers at the moment of the plane's impact with the ground flew to the nose, which is natural in such a trajectory of the fall. However, there are numerous pieces of flesh on the wall at the end of the passenger compartment. This could only happen if a large enough force to tear a person to shreds was applied in the opposite direction of the impact, but you didn't have to be an engineer or an investigator to realize it was bad. It was obvious to the ordinary laborers who were the first to run to the wreckage. They immediately noticed that the crash site smelled strongly of dynamite. If airplane crashes were new in 1949, the practice of deliberately sabotaging passenger airplanes did not exist at that time. The crash of Flight 108 was the third such incident in world history. The first incident was the bombing of a United Airlines Boeing 247 in Indiana in 1933. To this day, it is unknown who blew up that flight, which is not surprising. Unknown bombers literally invented a new kind of crime. In this situation, the very fact that investigators were able to uncover criminal intent in the airplane crash is commendable. The second such incident occurred just a few months before the disaster in Canada. The explosion in the Philippines hit all the world's newspapers, not so much because of the scale of the tragedy, but because of the scandalous nature of the story. A major airplane crash, which took the lives of 13 people, was arranged by a couple in love. The woman's husband was on a flight to Manila, and they decided to get rid of him in such an extravagant way. Accordingly, there were no clear guidelines and methodologies for investigating airplane bombings, but the fact of the explosion itself helped put the existing evidence into some context. Douglas DC-3 airplanes had two baggage compartments in the tail and in front of the cockpit. The tail of the airliner was relatively intact after the crash. The nose was naturally broken because the airplane landed on it, and everything in between was blown to rubble. Two seats from the cabin were missing on the spot, which was eventually found 400 meters away from the hull of the plane. When they started to check, it turned out that these seats were right at the front baggage compartment. Bellinger and his assistants began examining the flight's cargo manifest. At the time of the explosion, there were 8 suitcases of passengers on board. Another 3 valises and 2 typewriters belonged to people who were on the same flight 2 days earlier. The plane was small and their belongings did not fit in the luggage at that time. The plane was also carrying 3 packages. One was auto parts, the other was underwear. Normal commercial transportation. The contents of the third were unregistered, but it was private. IT was sent from San Simeone by Delphi Bouchard to an Alfred Plouffe in Bay Como. Bay Como is a very small town, and the detectives had little difficulty in finding out that no Alfred Plouffe lived there. There were 2 Delphi Bouchards in Saint Simeon, a man and a woman, but they knew nothing about the mysterious package. Obviously, the bomb was in this box, but finding out who sent it was more difficult. The clerk at the airport remembered not so much the mysterious sender as the obliging cab driver who helped him carry the box to the counter and even gave him a tenner for change. The box was very heavy. The dark-haired, heavy woman in her 40s who handed it to the clerk could barely lift it. The cab driver's memory was better. The dark-haired, elegant woman paid $3.45 for the ride and gave him a 55-cent tip. She was most likely a Quebec City native because on the way back, she ordered him to drive to Chateau. Not Chateau Frontenac, as commuters usually say. A heavy box in her hands was marked fragile. All along the way, the woman chided the driver for being dashing. Once dropping, "I'm not carrying eggs after all." When the man heard the plane crash, he told an acquaintance, "That lady I was taking to the airport is gonna lose her package." He remembered where he picked up the passenger, but he didn't know her first or last name. It's one thing to look for a man in Fishing Bay Como, and quite another in the provincial capital. That was no way to find the bomber. Meanwhile, the police gave the bodies of the dead to the relatives, and funeral processions began to gather in various corners of Quebec City on the same day. September 14th, they said goodbye to pilot Pierre Larin, Rita Morel, Madame Roméchi Pardux, and 3 of her children. Her 11-month-old son was buried with her in the same position in which they were found at the crash site. The woman was cradling the baby in her arms on the same day. Jury met in the city to consider the circumstances of the case. On the basis of the materials collected, it reached a verdict that the deaths of the passengers were accidental deaths caused by an explosion of unknown origin. This decision was a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it absolved Canadian Pacific of responsibility for the crashes. On the other hand, there was no mention in the decision of the criminal nature of what happened, giving the authorities the opportunity to put the case on the table. Jean-Louis Lanner was not particularly reassured by the decision, and his subordinates kept digging. When the hot trail led to nothing, Jules Parrott began to look for a motive. In order to send 22 people to the other world, there had to be a significant reason, and it could only be found by looking in the biographies of the deceased. Obviously, the first to fall under the magnifying glass were 3 Kennecott Copper executives. Big American businessmen must have had many enemies. Plus, the whole story would not look so absurdly cruel if the targets of the murders were 3 people. Not one, but the audit showed that there were no particular conflicts surrounding the company. Yet, Stannard is a technical genius, a talented manager, and a philanthropist. During his tenure, he made Kennecott Copper the largest company in the industry. Having accomplished all he could in his position, he was preparing to retire peacefully. Together with Arthur D. Stork and I.J. Parker, they visited the company-owned mines to bring the successor up to speed. That's how the 3 Americans ended up in Canada. For a short time, attention was focused on A&DR Paul Bouchard. According to the passenger manifest, he was sitting right next to the front baggage compartment. The fact that the man's body had never been recovered was suspicious. After all, it wasn't a given that the bomb was actually in the luggage. However, it was hard to dig up anything on a 32-year-old man returning from a family vacation with his wife and young child. Looking ahead, we would like to say that Andre Paul did find his last shelter. On September 16th, his body was discovered by a search party consisting of friends and relatives of the man. Rescuers somehow overlooked the body, lying only 100 meters from the crash site. The sleuths moved on down the list. 2 inspectors from the Bank of Montreal, 2 representatives of the Ontario Paper Company, flying to visit a paper mill in Baie-Comeau, a 47-year-old widow visiting her sister in Montreal. Rita Morel is a wife and mother of a 4-year-old girl who got on the plane in the first place to help her husband conduct a business deal. And no wonder her husband Albert was so heartbroken that he traveled to the crash site. On the other hand, if he was supposed to be on that flight, maybe he was the target. Parrott decided to take a closer look at the man. He relayed the information to his boss Benji, who in turn contacted Quebec City PD. Did they recognize Albert there? A couple months ago, patrol officers spotted him threatening a young girl in the street with a gun. The man ran away, but police recognized his name as they walked the victim home. The victim, Marie-Ange Robertel, was not even 20 years old when the police knocked on her door. They did not ask her anything about the man. Instead, they described the woman who brought the package to the airport and asked her if she knew anyone matching that description. Yes, of course, Robertel replied. This is Madame Peter. The crash of Flight 108 was heavily covered in the news, but the last official information at the time was the jury's verdict. Quebec City residents, including the new suspects, did not yet know that the investigation into the crash was still ongoing. The police therefore decided not to knock on Mme. Peter's door immediately, so that she would not have the opportunity to warn Albert that the detectives were interested in him. Instead, they decided to exploit the cab driver who drove the mysterious woman to the airport. For many hours, the man sat in his cab in front of her door. The police asked the cab driver to identify her once out of the house. The woman was in no hurry to come out. The cab driver was then ordered to knock on her door and say that someone had called for a car at that address. The door was opened by an acquaintance of hers. After that, the police had a new plan. They asked a local judge to call Madame Marguerite Peter and say that they needed to discuss her son. He was in trouble with the law, and concern for his offspring finally drove the woman out of the house, except she wore sunglasses before she left. and the cabbie couldn't accurately identify her as his passenger. Detectives decided to wait for the next opportunity or lead, and they made a mistake. The cab driver had not only a good memory, but also a long tongue. Unable to keep his mouth shut any longer, he called a reporter he knew from El Canada newspaper and told him about his undercover operation with the police. On September 15th, the front page of the publication reported that law enforcement had picked up the trail of the woman who had brought the mysterious package to the airport. 3 days later, Madame Peter ended up in the hospital. Presumably after a suicide attempt, she was not particularly injured, but spent a little less than a week under the care of doctors. It became clear that we should not delay in asking questions. An interesting fact is that until 1972, attempted suicide was a criminal offense in Canada. When Marguerite Peter returned home from the hospital on September 23rd, handcuffs were snapped on her wrists. Marguerite Peter had one dangerous character trait. She did not know how to say no. This trait is rumored to be what made her the mother of 14 children, of which she only raised 2. It got her into trouble with the law periodically. At the age of 22, Margaret even served a couple of months in jail because of illegal alcohol trafficking. It was the one that eventually caused her death. Margaret grew up in the logging camp where her father worked and adopted many of the traits of the desperate and tough men who surrounded her. At the same time, she was outgoing, charismatic, and kind. Thanks to these traits, Madame Marguerite Peter easily found common ground with anyone from detective to gangsters. She was never declared a criminal, but the line between what was good and what was bad was hard to draw. The woman almost always had a regular job, and in between Madame Marguerite Peter would concoct criminal cases to haul away extra money or just for favors to acquaintances. It was at one of her regular jobs that she met Joseph Albert Guay. During World War II, they both ended up in a gun factory. There was a pragmatic element in their relationship, and Guay sometimes borrowed money. Peter, and she set him up with her brother, a watchmaker who repaired Albert's goods. Nevertheless, Margaret was genuinely fond of her younger comrade. In the lower town where they both then lived, there were rumors that there was more than friendship between Albert and Marguerite Peter. Both of them always denied it. Albert, when these rumors reached him through a friend, exclaimed indignantly, "Have you seen her at all?" Margaret said Albert was like a son to her, and children are loved without doubting their feelings and fulfill their requests without too many questions. So Madame Marguerite Peter had little objection when Albert asked her to take some package to the Quebec City airport on September 9th, 1949. He told her that the box contained a fragile statue. Margaret handled the request responsibly, safeguarding the package during the trip. In his requests, Albert only went too far once. On September 19th, he finally read the local newspaper. By then it had reached Margaret what a story she had been dragged into. Albert came to her home and told her that the woman was in big trouble, but he had come up with a solution. Margaret should commit suicide and write in her suicide note that she blew up the airplane because she thought Albert would be on board. That's when the woman first thought her body was going too far. She called an ambulance, complaining of old stomach problems, and already in the hospital she had swallowed sleeping pills, not to kill herself, to draw the doctor's attention to her problem. At least that's what Madame Peter said. On September 23rd, Joseph Albert Guay was having dinner at home in a very bad mood. He had turned 30 the day before, and his plans for a celebration had not materialized. Marie-Ange Robitaille, the girl whom he had threatened with a gun, refused to meet him that date. His only company at the dinner was his mother-in-law. Before the disaster, the couple had lived with Rita's parents, and after the death of his wife, Guay for some reason decided not to move out. The radio was on during the dinner. There was a sensation on the evening news. The police had caught the woman who had delivered the bomb on Flight 108, and she was actively testifying. Guay thumped his fist on the table frustratedly and shouted bloody whore. Then he quickly packed up and ran out of the house. Albert went to his mother, but by that time the Attorney General had already issued warrants for his arrest, and the suspect was searched at all known addresses. The police were waiting for him at his parents' house. It was hardly surprising that the sneaky Albert ran to the most obvious address to hide. He had nowhere to go, and not just because all of Quebec already knew about his role in the airplane crash. All his life Guay had built himself up as a lofty, charismatic and generous guy. But his ego and natural temper always prevailed. By the time he was 32, the illusion had completely fallen apart, and he didn't have many friends left, even at his wife's funeral. The people standing behind his back jeered at the pictures of the young widower's suffering. Only his wife's probably unhappy parents believed in this grey spectacle. They were shocked at the news of the arrest. His mother-in-law could only say confusedly, "He is a boy with very big dreams. When Joseph Albert Gray was young, he wanted to be a singer or a conductor. Neither hearing nor voice he had, but we can assume that young Gray wasn't bothered by that at all. He probably didn't even think about the technical aspects of these professions. The only thing he was interested in was the spotlight." To achieve recognition in the situation in which Joseph Albert Gray grew up was difficult. He was the youngest of 5 children in a family of a railroad worker. When he was 5, his father was killed in a work accident. After that, the family moved closer to the city on the outskirts of Quebec. Albert did not receive a special education, but not particularly, then and sought it. From the age of 16, he sewed in billiard halls, whose visitors sold watches. He introduced himself to people as a watchmaker and jeweler. In fact, Gray bought jewelry watches from some people and sold them to others at a higher price. From the outside, he did not look like a small-time dealer, elegant and expensively dressed. Gray was always cheerful and distinguished by good manners. He hardly drank at all, helped elderly women on the street, and went to church. When he had extra money, Albert had no problem treating acquaintances in bars and lending them money. Providing such a lifestyle on his earnings was not easy, but Albert managed. He was tempted by a real job only once in his life during World War II. Most likely, he took a job at the Gray factory just to avoid the draft. But a steady job in addition to the watch trade allowed him to improve his financial situation. He even bought a car. At the factory, Albert was considered an eligible suitor. One of those whose attention he attracted was Rita Morel. In August 1941, they were married and moved into their own place in the Lower Town. Near the end of the war, Albert left the factory and became a full-time jewelry store clerk. He moved his family to a smaller town. There, in 1945, his only daughter was born to him. It was only then that things took a turn for the worse. Rita's attention became completely focused on the girl. That's when I realized I only wanted to be number to his own wife's life. On the plus side, Rita wasn't the only woman in the world. Albert had to travel a lot for work, and no one reprimanded him when he returned home at an ungodly hour. In the summer of 1947. On one such trip, Gray struck up a conversation with a waitress in a bar. Marie-Ange Robertel was 17 at the time. Well, she told Albert she was 19, a promising start to a relationship. Marie, of course, was well aware that her lover had a wife and a daughter. Things were quiet for a while until Albert sensed that things were serious. About a year later, he began to visit the family home Robertel regularly, showing his seriousness of purpose. At the same time, he moved his family back downtown, renting an entire floor of the new house. His mistress worked in the same neighborhood. Rumors in Lower Town spread quickly. At the end of 1948, they finally reached Rita Morel. She didn't immediately confront her unfaithful husband. She went and told Mary's parents. A few hours later, Robertel kicked her daughter out of the house. Marguerite Peter, who, as we remember, never said no, agreed to Gay's request and put up his mistress. A week later, he rented Marie a separate apartment, but he himself continued to live with his lawful wife. From the natural further development of the relationship was sometimes separated by one major problem. Gray was a Catholic, among whom divorce is notoriously discouraged. For a few months Marie tolerated, and then decided to send Gray and returned home. Her parents by then were ready to take their daughter back, but Marie's separation plan was very strange. A little earlier, she had lied to her parents that she lived in Montreal, so as not to incur even more anger. To make the lie convincing, the girl decided to arrange that they would meet her on the platform. She bought tickets to Montreal and back and went to the station. The journey did not immediately go well. On the train, Montreal became Albert, who promised to throw a tantrum if she did not go with him. Together, they went to Marie's apartment, where Gray burned her gloves and went to bed in her coat so she could not leave the next morning for the same purpose. He also bit the girl's face, and then he took her second ticket, cashed it at the box office. Those two cost each other. Drama. But in Gay's eyes, the situation looked downright tragic. He couldn't live without Marie, and she didn't want to see him. Not because she didn't love him, but because he was tired of the endless chaos and uncertainty that Albert was bringing to her life. Then Gray realized that this problem had only one logical solution. He must kill his wife. In April 1949, Albert turned to a friend and offered him $500 to kill Rita. He had already thought of everything. The poison would be dissolved in a bottle of his favorite wine. The friend listened to Gay's proposal, thought he was crazy, and politely declined. Meanwhile, in Albert's personal life, the cycle of events continued. Rita finally got tired of tolerating his behavior, and she went to live with her mother, taking her daughter with her. Gray, who found the long-awaited freedom, although not in the eyes of God, again began to annoy Marie. So by that moment had already safely returned to her parents and did not particularly burn desire to see her former lover. It was then that the episode with the gun threats in the street occurred. The police eventually caught the man, but hoped to fine him for illegally carrying a gun, thanks in large part to Madame Peter, who bailed him out and found him a lawyer. Then Albert tried a different tactic. He persuaded Marie to meet and told her that his wife wanted to put the girl in jail for defamation after that arrest incident. The best strategy in this situation, stated he hired. It is unclear why, but Marie believed him, and together they flew to Montreal. It was May in the Philippines. The very same plane had crashed. The story of the lovers who decided to get rid of an unwanted spouse with the help of a bomb on board was covered by Canadian newspapers. It is difficult to say for sure, but these articles must have fallen on the eyes of Albert Gray. At least in June, he boarded Flight 108 with Marie on the pretext of a business trip. He kept his eyes on the window, making notes in his notebook. By June, Albert had completely fed up with Marie. As she left for the last time, he didn't stop her, just held out a note. I love you terribly. We'll be together very soon. His infidelities were no secret, and if the woman died, suspicion would immediately fall on him. Another thing if Rita dies in a crash and the plane falls into the river. Then it would be difficult to find proof, and there would be nothing to link him directly to the scene of the crime. But Rita still had to be persuaded to get on the plane. Gray began to prepare the ground. In early August, he had taken his lawful wife on a week's vacation with a hotel where he had been good to her. Rita took this as a step toward reconciliation. At the same time, somewhere in Quebec City, a bomb was being assembled to kill her. From before that, Albert left and 2 suitcases of jewelry prepared for sale. He asked his wife to fly to get them. As he had no time for that, Rita doubted, but decided not to refuse her husband, who all that period behaved exemplary. To avert suspicion, Gray bought round-trip tickets. On the way out of the ticket office, Albert noticed an insurance vending machine. For 50 cents, he insured his wife's life for 10,000 Canadian dollars. On the morning of September 9th, Gray drove Rita to the airport. There they had an altercation. The woman was afraid to fly and did not want to get on the plane. Nevertheless, he managed to persuade her. Rita was one of the last to board the plane. I guess when Gray heard the news of the disaster on the radio a couple hours later, he must have felt like a genius. He had conceived and executed such an elaborate plan. It would be impossible to tie it to the plane crash. All of this, of course, was wrong. Gray had made a bunch of mistakes, of which 2 were decisive. First, he didn't calculate that the flight might be delayed, and even more so because of their quarrel. Because of this delay, the plane hit the ground rather than the water, which is why the evidence was preserved. Another thing Gray didn't realize is that if you're gonna kill someone and get away with it, you don't go around talking about it. Albert was so unconcerned about confidentiality that one of his interlocutors even tried to warn Rita of the possible danger. All the details above were cleaned from eyewitness accounts and gossip. Some details were probably added by journalists. There is no first-hand information. Gray himself has not spoken since his arrest. However, and without it so far could do without it, detectives had eyewitness testimony and the testimony of Madame Peter. According to her, Gray, not himself, confessed, and the contents of the parcel, just before offering it to her, committed suicide. At the scene of the crime was found a battery from a bomb battery of the same type Albert had bought shortly before the explosion. Nor did the fact of Rita's life insurance speak in his favor. The main question was who had packed in any bomb, but that mystery was solved pretty quickly too. Again, largely thanks to Madame Peter. As it turned out, she had bought the dynamite. The explosive device was assembled by her watchmaker brother, Jean-Riux Rist. They both claimed that they knew nothing of Albert's intentions and thought he would need it to uproot the roots of the trees on his property. In any case, the prosecution had a solid case on its hands. Several major witnesses carefully assembled interpreted evidence. The trial began on February 24, 1950. The attention of the entire city was riveted on the trial. It was the biggest event in Quebec City's history since the Roosevelt and Churchill Conference in 1944, despite the February frost. Every day, even before the trial began, a crowd of gawkers gathered outside the courthouse. He watched the process without any interest, occasionally falling asleep during the testimony of witnesses. The accused himself did not take the stand. In the entire 2.5 weeks, he had only shown emotion once. When, during her statement, Marriage declared that she no longer loved him, on March 14th, the jury went to deliberate. It took them only 17 minutes to reach a decision. The judge cried when he sentenced Guay to the gallows. Albert filed only one appeal, never making it to the highest court. His real plan for sipping execution was quite different. After all, he was not going down alone. After the trial, Guay was brought to a prison near Montreal, where prisoners with the same fate traditionally awaited execution day. There Albert spoke for the first time. In a wine statement, he accused Marguerite Peter and wife Jean-Riux Rist of conspiring to blow up an airplane. Both, he said, knew full well that he had no intention of uprooting any roots but wanted to blow up his wife and were fully involved in planning the crime. After another change of location this time, the year moved to the prison where the sentence was to be carried out. He once again repeated his testimony. A few days later, Rist's wife was arrested. Detectives have always doubted the veracity of Jean-Riux Rist's testimony. Too much. Guay spent too much time with the watchmaker during the bomb-making process. Plus, it's not entirely clear why a clockwork device would be created for gardening. On June 14, 1950, his sister Marguerite Peter was arrested at the preliminary hearing of the Jean-Riux Rist case. She was initially detained for threatening one of the witnesses, but she was never released from detention. MME Marguerite Peter faced a whole bunch of charges ranging from murder to attempted suicide. Most likely, Guay began cooperating so actively with the investigation in order to become a witness at the trials of Jean-Riux Rist and Marguerite Peter. Such a move would put off his date with the gallows for a long time, but the plan didn't work. Jean-Riux Rist was tried without Guay, and Rigen did not live to see Marguerite Peter's trial at all 9 days after Jean-Riux Rist was found guilty of murder. Joseph Albert Guay was hanged in Bordeaux prison. His last words were, "Well, at least I'll die famous." The brother and sister never admitted their guilt. During the Jean-Riux Rist trial, witnesses said the watchmaker must have known Gay's plan to blow up the plane. Madame Marguerite Ritgros, on the other hand, is more complicated. There was never much evidence against her, except for Albert's own testimony. To this day, many doubt that Marguerite Peter deserved to die for her part in the crime. Nevertheless, that is exactly what she got. Jean-Riux Rist and Marguerite Reiter went through all stages of the appeal and lost each of them. On July 25, 1952, Jean-Riux Rist took his final journey. Conditions in prison aggravated his chronic ailments, and the man was driven to the gallows in a wheelchair. On January 9, 1953, his brother was followed by Marguerite Peter, who became the last woman to be executed in Canada. Fortunately, Albert Gay's fame did not last long. The details of his atrocity were quickly forgotten, and now it is difficult to even understand what in this story actually happened and what did not. There are at least 3 versions of events, each of which contradict each other. Now, few people remember this crime, which in 1949 was impossible to even imagine, and only rare. Walking in the woods near Sous-Coquin sometimes stumble upon the wreckage of a Douglas DC-3 airplane, which remains lying there at the site of the deaths of 22 people.